Hi everybody, it's nice to have you in this cozy little book nook, if you will. And I'm Alexander D'Agostino, and this is my exhibition, The Index of Fire. It's the last of 3 exhibitions I've had this year, so it was definitely a year of producing, and kind of finding a way to manage my research practice with the physical tasks of producing the artwork. This show is sort of a reflection of both my love for books, my obsession with books, my fascination with the kind of persistence of queer culture, and different moments in history of persecution and the sort of cycles that we see. To be honest, I had a little bit of that naive feeling that we weren't going to be having like a Trump kind of Nazi feeling coming into our country next, although I'm a little bit sort of, I would say, pessimistic in general about like the direction of this country. I'm always a little bit like, ooh, I'm an artist and it's my job to both provide a lot of honest feelings about the work I create, but also to kind of sometimes feel this pressure to produce a sense of hope. And when I was making this show, it was a really interesting kind of like heavy feeling. And it was one of those like, almost like those cliche, like the energy was being sucked out of me at the end of the year. And then you get this exuberance of putting the work up and it gives you a little bit of clarity. So the idea of the Index of Fire started just thinking about book burning and book bans and how I would make an exhibition out of that. And while that was happening, I had only 1 cat now, but I had 2 cats that were unneutered. And Franklin, my precious little shadow cat, went to my favorite books, like, you know, my collection of Anne Rice witch books, some of my old occult volumes that I study, some of my art books, and just started marking them. Or when they're unfixed, it's like a combination of urine and hormone stuff. So you can't really save those books unless you want to like soak them in vinegar and baking powder, and no one wants to do that. So instead I set the books outside of my kind of shrine altar space on Tyson Street, which if you're a John Waters fan, it's like the street that Divine ate dog shit on. I look out my window and I see that historic moment. So animal drama seems appropriate for the kind of work that I do because my cats are, you know, my fur babies. So I let the books kind of basically sit outside for a whole year and absorb that energy. And then wasn't sure if they would become sculptures. And I discovered that ashes can be used to bleach and reduce the tones and cyanotypes. And so I thought to burn all those books would be kind of like a poetic way of giving them their own space in the exhibition, to include my love for my cat in a sneaky way, but also to create this fascinating chemical process where you take a cyanotype, which is usually that rich blue, and then you put it in, you can use bleach sometimes, or you can use ashes and water, and that creates a soda ash. And then that doesn't bleach, but it reduces the colors. So when you pull these out of the ash water, usually they just look like there's nothing, maybe very pale yellow, almost piss yellow, which is kind of appropriate considering Franklin had that moment. But then I just soak them in Lipton's tea to get that nice brown black color. It's a really fascinating process. To me, this also kind of created this like unexpected look of a old book. In my other area of work, I do research in old manuscripts. I work at the Folger Shakespeare Library with their old spell books. There's a lot there. If you've never looked at an old book, all you have to do is register to be a researcher, free of charge, and then you too can touch old paper. But that ability to create that feeling of a book being so fragile was something that I felt like the show kind of did on its own. You know, the aesthetics from one print or one exhibition to the other seem to be decided almost on an intuitive level by the space they're in. And so this just felt like I could really have like a clean environment to let this work happen. And part of the strategy for the work itself was to gather images of different book burnings throughout history. Because if we focus just on the kind of May 10th book burning, the Nazi book burning, it can make it seem like this, whenever a book is burned, that it leads immediately to a genocide. But often book burning is happening throughout history for various forms of censorship. The most books that are burned in the world right now are burned by the publisher companies, so the books that get sent back to the publishers. their, I guess, reuse or recycling of them is just to burn them. So it's kind of I don't know, I thought it's a lot of like funny contradictions. You'll see in some of the prints themselves like a repeat of that one shadow figure throwing a book in a fire. That's from a recent book burning in 2022 in Tennessee. There's a MAGA extreme pastor, Greg Locke, who was holding these book burning events. And so at this event, it was encouraged people bring their like Twilight books, their occult books, tarot cards, things like that. And then at the event, a gay couple took a Bible and threw it in and made out and said, "Hail Satan." So there's always this sort of contrarian reaction thing. It doesn't matter if you burn a book that's printed today. That's one thing I think is sort of fascinating about books, is that because they're printed, because they're so digitized, unless it's like a unique handwritten object and outside of the sentimentality of a book, it's not really going to do much but spark more interest. So that's kind of the whole process, and that's sort of how my brain approaches thinking about work, kind of embodying it, doing a lot of heavy research to get the images very specific. So it's not just like, oh, these beautiful people from a different period, but very specific individuals that I'm looking at. And then one of the ways I thought would be kind of fun and sort of quirky to present the work is to also show these two books, which were burned in 2024 in February. I can't remember her name, mainly because I try to keep it out of my head so I try to stalk her on social media and have that brain rot. But she was running for Secretary of State in Missouri, and she took these books out of the Missouri Public Library and she set them up. She took a blowtorch and she said, "When I'm in charge, I'll making sure that we get rid of all these like groomers and faggots." And she used the word faggots, faggot, faggot, faggot. She used that word a lot in her campaign. And people still voted for her because people have this visceral response to this idea of children being kind of taken under the wing of these sort of deviant people, and that like queer culture is dividing the family, which it's not dividing the families as much as I would say extreme political ideologies that are creating this schism for people. So that's, hello, it's kind of wild. But these books were burned, but as you can see, these ones have survived the flames. And as such, when they were burned, you did see like an uptick of book sales. So in some ways, it's sort of like bad press is good press. It is terrifying when I think about these people who do these things today and who target queer content as if it's a form of pornography. That freaks me out. If you've looked underneath the prints, you'll also see that there are some pornographic images, because this printmaking process started when I was gifted a box of vintage gay porn from a neighbor that was discovered after his death, which is pretty common, and like especially a generation of gay men who sort of survived AIDS and survived Reagan and all of that. They would hide a lot of their identity. So that sort of ties into this idea of censorship. And as an artist, I feel like I both say everything all the time, but I always feel like I'm sometimes a little bit like afraid. Like maybe it could be like a neurotic fear, but there's a little bit of that like, oh, if I really tell people what I think, then these crazy lib of TikTok people will dox me and be like, oh, this is a groomer, which is so silly because like the contrarian in me, like hearing gay people being called groomers, I'm like, well, yes, like I do believe in the gay agenda. Like I hope all children could be queer. Like that's maybe being silly, but at the same time, I'm like, I don't know what the problem is. And this book itself, The Ultimate LGBT Guide for Teens, it's like a crazy good resource that when you're in high school and you don't know how to talk about your sexuality or your gender or have more nuanced conversations, books like these can be like a lifeline for kids. And so you see these not being available in public schools for kids. So then we think that they're not going to have access to information. But what's likely going to happen is people are going to want to read the taboo content a little bit more. So one of my strategies for playing with books is bibliomancy. It's like tarot reading for books. So the way that I'll do that is just simply open a page, and then from Queer, The Ultimate LGBTQ Guide for Teens. When people try to unqueer you, no one can change the fact that you're queer. But some adults may freak out about it and try to change you through reparative therapy, also called conversion therapy. I do go to the Catholic church down the street and rip down the signs in their bathrooms that offer same-sex conversion. So if you ever want something to do, go to the Basilica in Baltimore and rip down the signs that give you a phone number if you're a kid to call people, because you should not be thinking you're a problem. So that's what this brings up. And then I think about, okay, let's talk about the history of book burning of May 10th, 1933. So this is the Nazi book burning. And the people that threw the books in the fire were not adults, they were children. They were part of the Hitler Youth Organization to attack the Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute of Sexology. But I think it's really important to know that on the bookend of this magnificent book burning, we still have records of people that were trying to be erased during this disturbing moment in history. We still see this today. You're not going to get rid of gender affirming care for people. The transing of children is really just the language to affirm that maybe you recognize that the way that you exist is different from who you are or how people are expecting you to function in society. So I think it's really incredible to find pictures of people from 1920s who had hormonal therapy. It was described as like gonad surgery. It was described as like half gender affirming surgery. The language is always going to change. But even before World War II, there were queer people who were thriving in themselves. So when I think about this sort of narrative of when people try to unqueer you, that's really people being afraid of their own internal sense of who they are. Like often when someone has queer phobia or an anger towards trans people, it's a reaction to something that challenges something deep inside of themselves. It's chaotic, it's wild. So I knew this was, I was like, I'm gonna have emotions. I'm gonna try and be stoic, but I think crying is kind of fierce. So again, more of that. Us against the world, being a queer couple definitely has its perks. Sharing clothes, making out in the bathroom, endless snuggles, but it can also be a challenge. In some parts of the country, teens are still fighting to be able to take same-sex dates to the prom, or even to hold hands on school grounds. In some private schools, you can be expelled for having a queer relationship. It's pretty ridiculous. Then there are occasional awkward social moments. And so, you know, when I think of like partnership, I think of like we have these narratives of relationships. I'm one of those people that wasn't a huge fan of like marriage equality because I knew what would happen is we would stop it, like this attempt to see queerness and instead put queerness into an existing structure of husband and wife. I mean, I love gay marriage. I think it's cool at the same time. I've never officiated anything but a straight wedding, so I don't know what a gay wedding would be like. But I do also think that we live in this world where there are always going to be sort of social expectations, and marginalized communities are often going to have to take the kind of Atlas-like burden of deciding to be grateful for some things, but then maybe thought of as being a little bit dim and dark if they can't find their route to their own happiness. So maybe that makes me think about, okay, how do I deal with the chaos of that? And as a researcher, it's going back through time and learning to kind of find these interesting moments when people throughout history are silenced, but that doesn't stop the information. So, you know, you see these images from like the ancient China when the texts of Confucius were burned, and also the monks were burned after the books were burned, and how that was basically an imperial shift to get a certain ideology about consciousness, about philosophy. These kinds of things were being erased from people. Books of astrology, interestingly, in this moment were kept, which is weird because books that tend to be burned the most are the Bible or books of magic and astrology. So it's kind of funny. And then I'm like, okay, I'm still stressed about book burning. I'm still like trying not to be overwhelmed by what's happening in the world. So then I hear about the books of Arius that are being burned, and these are this narrative that maybe the Father, Son, Holy Ghost wasn't an extension of God, but there are three separate spiritual entities. And in Constantine times, that was very controversial. So the idea was you have to burn those books, and then suddenly the narrative of the Holy Trinity becomes a little bit more of a global collaboration with other aspects of like colonizing and creating the world that we now know, which is a fun world, but it's a messy world. And then, of course, I love this sort of spiritual belief that we see in the Bible of burning of the books and this idea of the blasphemy. You can also use a Bible as a spell book, so that's sort of fascinating. And then I think about the resilience of the book. So this is the story of a Franciscan monk kind of trying to burn a book, and he's praying to God that the books won't be burned. And so this book survives the flame. And I think that's when my brain, as a researcher, started to be like, yeah, that's right. My cat can piss on all my spell books, and I can set them on fire, but still, like a phoenix, we can rise out of the ashes. So then you, of course, see this next moment of a timeline, which is two Hitler Youth burning books. Obviously, these are books that are mostly things like Kafka or all of the records from the Sexology Institute. And this image right here of this man, that's Magnus Hirschfeld. And if you need a good queer viewing, it's called Different from the Others, 1919, a response to the paragraph, what is it, 165, I think, the Nazi anti-gay one. This was sort of like a film to protest that. And so it's a really interesting moment of cinematic history that most of the footage was burned, so you'll find a lot of the film is just film stills. But I thought it was important to keep returning to that image because I think it's just so incredible that this person was fearless and he was a support system for people who were like, my world doesn't think I have any place to exist. And so in this narrative, this individual is being blackmailed because he's a famous pianist, and to get money out of him, someone's like, I'm gonna go to the press and let people know that you're having sex in the woods. And so he goes to the Sexology Institute and he gets this really interesting affirmation that it's just like, don't fight who you are, we can get through this. Like, and the most important thing is like, you love yourself, you're gonna have other people reflect that back on you. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of like old as mold, that reality, that we can care for ourselves that way. So I just sort of like thinking about all of these things. And then this is the woman trying to burn the book. This is the actual book that she set on fire. I wanted to blur her face just because she's tacky. Her brother, interestingly, is gay, and he was a member of a gay organization in Missouri. But when they found out he also voted for her, they're like, this just doesn't track. And then, it sort of ends to like, I'm like, what are the other book burnings that are happening? And obviously what's happening in Gaza right now, lots of libraries have been destroyed. And the spectacle of a book burning is always the thing that's the most uncanny. So when I see like this IDF soldier, I'm like, what? I don't see Hamas in that book, but I think that's maybe what he was looking for. This narrative that Hamas is like the threat to the state of Israel. When you see everyone being just destroyed, mostly just all that's left right now of like true Palestinian people, it's like, limbless children, young people. Like there's no elders, there's no old society. It's all these people whose lives have been destroyed out of our tax-paid money, and that's where I'm like, God, like what a shit show to be alive in this time. But bringing it to the end of that isn't to say like, we're just screwed and we're gonna have more book burnings. It's that we need to be aware of history. So then I kind of decided to put the Project 2025 pictures in it. And if you read Project 2025, it reads like a campy 1950s, like Red Scare, Lavender Scare, like panic that, these sort of moral corruptions are happening in America. Mostly it's like very clearly like anti-queer, anti-black. So the language that you read in this, that it's kind of obfuscated just through the printing process, is focusing on this narrative that like purveyors of LGBT content, pornography is like, should be a felonious act, felony. It should be something that's taken out of libraries, which is weird because I don't think you should be reading Mein Kampf, but I shouldn't tell you to not read a book. I should just let you have your own choice. And I think that the country that we live in, the US, for all of its flaws, that's something that I think I can feel kind of cool about in the US, is that we can go there. Like I could burn a flag, and as long as it's not causing a problem, I can have the freedom to do that. And I don't have to worry about any harm coming to me from that, in theory. Project 2025, funded by the Heritage Foundation, is this sort of think tank that the Trump administration claims to not be connected to. Whether we actually see book bannings happen, or whether we see people not having access to critical race theory, which is usually part of law school, not public education. But then what that turns into is you go to high school, you don't get to talk about white privilege, you don't get to talk about the history of racism in America. It's going to actually be terrifying because it's going to make people have to feel like they can't express themselves or censor themselves. As an artist, I know if I have an opportunity in certain states, what risk am I putting myself at if I'm going to go in Michigan, for example, I saw a call for shows and it was like, do you make work that protests the paradigm of the world we're in right now? Is your work a reflection of what it is like to be oppressed and challenged in the status quo? We want to put you out on Front Street. And that's a risk that an artist in an arts organization has to deal with. Luckily, I don't think Hillyer has any problems with that. So I think that's pretty good. I think the closest we've gotten to any of that in DC was like the Comet Ping Pong Pizzagate thing. And my theory of that kind of thing really was that there was a bunch of queer people doing a show called Witch Bitch, which I was in, using a lot of stage blood, using a lot of satanic themes, shortly after a bunch of kids had been there. And there was certain drag queens and people kind of going publicly about their concern for this sort of content. So I like to think like it's all myth, it's all fear, it's all chaos. Project 2025, the chances of a kind of national book ban, I don't see anything like that happening. But I do know like in Florida, people are like, well, I can't have a picture of my partner or my husband or my wife or any of that in public schools. So we're gonna see self-censoring, and that's the scariest thing. We're gonna see a lot less publicity for queer events at the Smithsonian because of how that funding is happening. So it's why art needs to keep kind of putting its claws out. So part of like the spell of this was I was gonna burn these pages because it felt sort of freeing, knowing that it's not gonna affect the document, but that the ritual itself is like a spell that lets me kind of put into the universe that like, I'm gonna say what I'm gonna say. I'm not gonna be afraid of it, even though on the DL, like I am terrified because when I look at media of historical moments of queerness, you do see how scary it gets. So we just have to, deal with that. So that's sort of like how this all work gets structured, is this like emotive process. And then every exhibition I do leads to something I call a queer shroud grid. I call these queer shrouds because I feel like this kind of pornographic imagery presented on fabric is giving Shroud of Turin for just the very simple ghostly aesthetic look. I think putting it on a grid is like the kind of contemporary art equivalent of like a Ouija board, where I'm like, oh, the queer ancestors, like the people who didn't make it through AIDS, or like the people who have lost themselves to self-harm and things like that can be accessed to here. Almost like it's a calling into the universe to like bring attention to the importance of visibility of these dialogues and to create these sort of collaged images that when you look at it, it is like smoke. Like you can kind of tell that's a person, but then maybe it gets lost in the distraction of these burnt pieces of fabric. But at the core of it, you look underneath it, and it's just like these playful images of men maybe smoking cigarettes and doing, I don't know, what they're doing. And then I put these books facing down, partially because to me it felt like it was a way to show the idea of like censoring the knowledge, the ineffectiveness of it. It's a tarot card. I'm not going to read that one because it's not a deck I'm familiar with. But so the sort of the structure of how this all was put together was to create this sort of shrine-like environment that tells you the story of books that have survived countless book burnings. There'll be probably more spectacle-based book burnings. There are people who are really upset with J.K. Rowling and they're burning Harry Potter books. I think that's ineffective because it's just going to give her more fuel. So it's just the same if you burn a bunch of queer books, it's going to ignite the queer people. If you burn a Bible to protest religion, you're only going to make people want their religion more. We're a very interesting species. If you tell us no, we tend to fight back. And so that's kind of the word vomit that this exhibition has created. I will now open this up for conversations if you have any or questions.
Have you done research now in the present in terms of countries that if you're gay, queer, that you will be killed or allowed to live or, are free? I know that Western European countries, you're okay.
But Eastern Europe, not necessarily.
What about African, Muslim? Do you know at this point in time in history if you would be literally, imprisoned, killed, or free?
Well, I feel like on a global level, you would say like in like Africa, the continent, different countries are going to have different laws.
Are they?
As far as I know, I know about like the book burnings that happened in Uganda that destroyed a lot of national records. I know that there's a lot of collaboration with organizations like the Heritage Foundation in Uganda specifically to kind of fuel these sort of anti-gay culture that they have there. Personally, like I know that it wouldn't be very safe feeling to go travel to see Egypt, as much as I'd love to see that history. I know that there's a lot of trickiness with that, but at the same time, I'm like a white male from America, so like I can mask that. And I think that is what is sort of more omnipresence, is the balance of people being able to kind of go within the closet or to exist.
So I think what I'm saying is, as bad, as imperfect as it is in America, I really haven't looked in. I kind of have a general feeling that I don't know the Muslim countries right now, where
Yeah.
you wouldn't be killed if you were found out. But I'm not sure if that's true. And so it's something I've
Yeah.
heard, and so I'm assuming you might know.
I mean, so like, you know, during the pandemic, I watched a lot of like independent queer films, and there was a lot of like, there's a whole genre of like Middle Eastern, like, you know, Palestine kind of conflict shows that are like Arab people and like, you know, Israeli or Jewish people having their relationships and what that's like in like a kind of apartheid nation. And I think that it is going to be riskier for more oppressive communities. Like my friends who I know from here who ended up going to live in Tel Aviv talk about how open it is if you're in the state of Israel.
Yes.
But if you're maybe not in the state of Israel, your queerness, even your like, your being like Arab could be more of a conflict. So that's like where my brain thinks a little bit more about that. When I look at like Russia, I know like there's like that issue with the boys missing in Chechnya. I know that Russia has made it so that you're not able to have really much visibility as a queer person. There's a lot more pushback. I'm seeing in Georgia right now, there are a lot of laws that were being passed that were going to make any kind of public display of homosexuality, public proclamation of who you are, criminalized. But I'm seeing pushback on that too. I think where it seems scarier is when people don't have the sort of resources to fight and they'll be more physically harmed. One thing I've heard is also like, I don't know what the argument, if it's tired or if it's just we don't know the answer, but people will say like, well, if you don't like America, like go to some other country and think about what it's really like to be queer. And then I think, well, okay, but like when I hear about all of the different countries in Africa that have like really violent like anti-gay policies, I'm like, those are funded like by things like the Heritage Foundation and American organizations. So it's like this kind of global interweaving.
So thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.
And you mentioned very briefly a couple of times where there was resilience of books,
Yes.
or the resilience of literature to survive. And I'm thinking about in Western culture after the demise of the Roman Empire, we almost lost that classical literature.
Yeah.
It was hanging by a thread, but where it survived was, of all places, the University of Baghdad, where it was translated into Arabic, then made its way back to the University of Toledo, which was Christian, Jewish, and Arabic, translated into Latin, and then makes its way into Italy. So it makes its way back into the Western canon by this very circuitous route. And I just wondered if you have any comments or thoughts on literature surviving in unexpected places and making its way back into the world.
Well, it definitely, like, once an idea is put out, like on a more of a spiritual level, or like my like witchy instincts of life is that like once something is out, it's out. You can't like put it back in. So I believe in the collective unconscious, you know. It wasn't one person who invented the accordion, but multiple like accordions were created at this different time. So when I think about like the books or the stories that have been taken, you know, you said they were moved out of like the Alexandria library, and that fall of the empire was very scary, and then they go to Baghdad and then they get transcribed to another language. I love that about books. My research in old magical grimoires, like the Folger Library has a spell book. It's all of the incantations are like from what would be like scripture. There wasn't that kind of Bible then, but it was biblical. But that was translated from Latin after having been translated to Arabic, you know, from older texts. So I think that the idea will always travel around. And I think that's, again, social media, is problematic as it can be, it is sort of a life force because it lets ideas continue to reinvent themselves. I think that that's also the interesting thing about like these books right now is when people see that like someone has burned like a LGBTQ book, chances are the book sales will go up. There was a bookshop in Baltimore that caught on fire this past fall, and it's already back up. Like people donated lots of money. They made sure that the floors in the bookstore were put back up, and there's an influx of customers now. So my thought is like maybe like the one light in it is that like with Project 2025, it's like the more that people see it, the more they're going to have a response to it. I think one of the dangers that happened with the pandemic and the mental health crisis of people wanting to shut off and the news being so intense that people were like kind of pigeonholed into their own little universe. So I think that's where books can be sneaky because, you know, obviously this is like says queer, so you're gonna be like, oh my God, it's queer. But there's other stories where just the characters exist and they have humanity. So I don't know. I personally, I mean, like you can't burn books anymore, like they're in print. I would be more, like I was sentimental about my Anne Rice witch books because I remember reading them and loving them, but I'm like, I can read those books again. It was like pre-printing press when book burning was a little bit more chaotic because you can't fix those books, so yeah.
I have a question, a much more less sophisticated question, I think, and that is about your materials.
Yeah, that's sophisticated.
About how and why you chose this type of cloth.
Yeah.
And these layers and how they're attached to each other. I didn't get a chance to go around and look at that really carefully, but
Yeah.
how did you go about sort of thinking through these materials?
Well, I got into cyanotypes during the pandemic. I was doing mostly performance art. I was like teaching 20 yoga classes a week, dancing in a club every night on the weekend, and then developing like dance and performance pieces, but was always a painter. And I think it was one of those, well, if I'm gonna be home, I should try those cyanotypes and put flowers down. And then through that discovered you can make prints, like photographs from them. And it just made sense to use this material. You can buy pre-coated cyanotypes on 8.5 by 11. I like an 8.5 by 11 format because it makes me think of paper. And I love my papers, which, you know, I'm a Gemini. Donald Trump's a Gemini, apparently. He loves to be appearing with stacks of paper. It's like an aesthetic. So I'm like, ugh, find your humanity in the darkness. But this, I don't know, you know, my grandmother was a quilter. Like textiles feel beautiful to me. I think of like the AIDS quilt, and I think that sort of is where this sort of grid-like structure happens. So the material itself, I just love, you can be rough with it. Like I'm not delicate, like I'm very heavy-handed. So when I make the prints, it's fun. You get to like, you know, rinse them in water and then soak them, you know, in the ash water I put in a cast iron cauldron out back, and then soaking them in the tea. It's all so visceral. And honestly, it's one of my favorite parts about the process. It doesn't happen till the end. Like I gather the images, I choose what's gonna happen. I kind of listen to that like intuitive art voice. And I love, like Jessica Stockholder, that artist said, she was like, what's intuition? It's certainly not stupidity. And I love thinking about it that way. Like I'm following materials and they just take on a life of their own. You know, like I didn't expect the pages to look like paper or burnt books. Like it just felt like that's where like I believe in something more invisible working around. So, thank you all.